Hello, and welcome to today's custom-tailored deep dive. It's really great to have you with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to get into this.
So today we are looking at a question that, honestly, it feels like it's pulled straight out of a speculative fiction novel.
It really does.
Right, but it is actually one of the most pressing architectural challenges of our time. We're asking, how do the massive, invisible systems that govern our world actually make decisions when the rules of the game just keep changing?
And, well, going a step further, how do they even survive when the threats against them are evolving at a literal quantum level?
Exactly.
Because it is a formidable architectural challenge. And to explore the solution, we are going to be analyzing a very specific, incredibly dense stack of sources today.
Very dense.
Yeah. We have three deeply technical papers written by Nnamdi Michael Okpala from OpenNexus Computing. These were published in July and August of 2025.
And what's great about these papers is they bridge the gap between this highly abstract mathematics and concrete deployable software architecture.
Right. We are looking at the foundational blueprints for systems that absolutely must survive volatile conditions. We're talking everything from violent shifting in market dynamics to full-blown attacks from quantum computers.
All without ever losing their core operational integrity.
Exactly.
So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack the core framework introduced in these papers. It's known as dimensional game theory, or DGT. We'll explore how this theory handles unpredictable, real-world variables and see how it's being fused with cutting-edge, quantum-resistant cryptography.
For an initiative known as the Aegis Project.
The Aegis Project, right,
Right.
which utilizes an architecture called RAF, or Regulation as Firmware.
And the transition from theory to firmware is where this gets incredibly high stakes. I mean, we're talking about automated governance layers that dictate how heavily fortified networks react to stress.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want to jump right into the first paper from July 2025. It's titled Formal Analysis of Game Theory for Algorithm Development.
A great starting point.
So Okpala takes traditional game theory, which, usually deals with static payoff matrices and finding a stable equilibrium, and he extends it into dimensional game theory.
Right.
The source material uses the visual of a bright red map pin to explain this, which I found super helpful. In a traditional sense, a map pin just gives you physical coordinates. But here, we are dropping that pin on abstract, strategic dimensions.
Well, it's a really powerful way to visualize it.
I'd love to hear you break down the mechanics of how this mapping actually functions within the algorithm, though.
Sure. So instead of longitude and latitude, the algorithm is locating a strategy's exact coordinates on behavioral axis.
Okay.
You might have an offensive axis or defensive axis or, say, a tactical evasion axis.
Yeah.
By constantly plotting these coordinates, the system builds a multi-dimensional map of an opponent's behavior.
I see.
And the core mathematical theorem that governs this space is what Okpala calls the perfect game theorem.
Right.
The math essentially states that in a two-player, zero-sum game, if both players are utilizing optimal strategies across all relevant dimensions, the outcome is always a deterministic tie.
Which is derived from the minimax theorem.
Exactly. Both sides are simultaneously minimizing their maximum possible loss.
But if a perfect game always ends in a deterministic tie, that implies the algorithm is actually looking for the moments when the game isn't perfect.
You hit the nail on the head. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the lack of a tie is the exact trigger this system is hunting for.
Because if it doesn't end in a tie...
There is a strategic imbalance. One player has deviated from mathematical perfection. And to detect these imbalances, the algorithm applies principal component analysis, or PCA, to historical game data.
Now, PCA is heavily used in machine learning to reduce the dimensionality of large data sets, right?
Yes, very common.
But how does that specifically isolate an opponent's weakness?
Well, when you have massive data sets of past interactions, say, millions of microtrades in a financial market, PCA lets the system mathematically collapse all that noise into the principal components.
The main axes of variance.
Exactly. It filters out the static and highlights the specific dimension where the opponent is over-indexed or weak. So if an adversary is highly volatile but structurally defensive, PCA isolates that specific defensive volatility dimension.
Oh, wow.
And once the algorithm detects that dimensional imbalance, it dynamically generates a counter strategy perfectly mapped to exploit those exact coordinates.
The paper actually provides some fascinating practical applications for this. Financial markets are an obvious one, where an algorithm could analyze trading data to detect when a market is being dominated by a momentum dimension versus a mean reversion dimension and shift its strategy.
Right, but where this gets really high stakes is physical safety.
Yes, it brings up autonomous vehicles navigating mixed autonomy traffic alongside human drivers.
That is a critical use case. Because a robotic driver operates on pure logic, but human drivers introduce massive behavioral variance.
They're predictable.
Very. So an autonomous vehicle using dimensional game theory can model the human drivers around it by dropping that red map pin on specific dimensional coordinates of, say, aggressiveness or risk aversion.
But how does a software system actually measure human aggressiveness in real time, though? I mean, it's not like the car can read the human's mind.
No, it measures it through proxy telemetry. The algorithm takes in variables like the human driver's falling distance, their braking velocity.
Well, the frequency of their lane changes.
Exactly, and microaccelerations. It feeds those physical metrics into the PCA engine, which maps them onto the abstract aggressiveness dimension. Then the system optimizes its own driving strategy.
Like increasing its own defensive buffering dimension.
Precisely, to maintain traffic flow and safety.
That makes perfect sense. Similarly, in cybersecurity, a defense system could parse packet structures and intrusion telemetry to identify if an attack leans heavily on a brute force dimension versus a social engineering vector.
And instantly reallocate its firewall resources.
Right. But mapping these dimensions assumes you know what inputs you are dealing with, which brings us to a massive hurdle.
The variadic inputs.
Yes. The second July 2025 paper, Variadic Strategy in Multi-Domain Contexts, tackles the problem of unfixed inputs.
Because in a closed lab environment, you know exactly how many variables you are analyzing. But in the real world, the data streams are dynamic and constantly shifting.
The paper introduces the concept of scalar promotion to deal with this. It uses the example of a voice communication toggle in a tactical simulation. It starts as a simple scalar input, a 0 or a 1, off or on.
Simple enough.
But the moment a player switches that comms toggle to on, the system is suddenly hit with a massive influx of new variables.
Right. It ceases to be a simple binary toggle. That single input promotes into a multidimensional vector. The system now has to account for frequency analysis, latency variations, linguistic stress markers, and potential deception in the audio stream. A single action forces the entire environment to expand.
But an explosion of data like that would cause traditional linear algorithms to experience computational runaway. How does this architecture process newly promoted dimensions without suffering a buffer overflow or just completely freezing up?
What's fascinating here is how the system ruthlessly filters that explosion of data using a mathematical function called dimensional activation mapping. It's denoted by the Greek letter phi.
Okay, the phi function.
This function acts as an intelligent gatekeeper. It evaluates all the newly promoted vectors, like those linguistic stress markers from the voice comms you mentioned, and runs a rapid calculation to determine their statistical relevance to the current strategic outcome.
So it basically just ignores the noise.
It relies on a strict safety valve known as the computability threshold, represented by the symbol theta. The system establishes a hard mathematical ceiling on the number of active matrices it will process simultaneously. This is purely designed to prevent processor overload or thermal runaway.
So not everything gets through.
Only the contextual inputs that cross a specific activation threshold called tau are allowed to participate in the strategy formulation.
So if the linguistic stress in the voice channel doesn't breach the tau threshold?
The system acknowledges it, but drops it from the active game matrix.
Incredible. So we have this highly robust theoretical framework for isolating strategic dimensions and filtering variadic inputs. But the crucial bridge is how you actually code this into a breathing system.
Which is the focus of the August 2025 paper.
Yes, fault-tolerant cryptographic integration.
This is where we examine the regulation as firmware, or RAF architecture. It's the deployment phase of the theoretical mathematics we've been discussing.
The paper outlines a systematic error classification framework written natively in Rust. It maps computational stress directly to operational responses using a 0 to 12 stress taxonomy.
Let's go through the zones.
Yeah, let me see if I have the zones mapped correctly. Zones 0 through 3 represent the warning oak state, which is standard operation.
Great.
Zones 3 through 6 cross into warning critical, where the system initiates enhanced monitoring. Zones 6 through 9 are critical danger, prompting the system to actively restrict operations and disable non-critical functions to protect the core.
Not violently.
Zones 9 through 12 represent the critical panic state.
Now, the panic state is particularly sophisticated. In traditional software, a critical panic often leads to a hard crash. But under the RAF taxonomy, the system executes strategic process termination.
It aggressively folds operations.
Exactly. While preserving cryptographic state and notifying stakeholders, it degrades gracefully rather than collapsing entirely.
But how does the firmware actually know it is experiencing stress? I mean, it doesn't have a biological nervous system, and it isn't just measuring CPU temperature.
It calculates its internal stress level dynamically using a weighted continuous formula. This formula aggregates three specific metrics. First, it measures the severity of any active policy violations. Second, it calculates the complexity deviation of the Synfese cost function.
I want to pause on that for a second. The Synfese cost function is mentioned a few times in the source material, but what exactly is it measuring in this context?
Think of the Synfese function as measuring the computational friction, or the energy required, to parse conflicting logic paths within the system.
Conflicting logic.
Right. So if the algorithm is receiving highly contradictory data streams, say market indicators pointing to both a crash and a rally simultaneously, the Synfese cost function spikes because resolving that logical conflict requires intense computational labor.
That makes the third metric in the stress formula even more intriguing. Along with policy violations and computational friction, the system evaluates prime gap entropy.
Yes.
It actually relies on the distribution of prime numbers to assess its own health.
It's brilliant. Prime numbers possess a natural, semi-predictable distribution as you move higher up the number line. The gaps between them follow specific mathematical laws. The RAF architecture continuously runs background calculations on these prime gaps. When a processor is operating normally, the time and memory required to process these gaps remain stable.
But under heavy computational stress,
Like a massive variadic input overload or a coordinated network attack, cache contention occurs. The processor begins to struggle, and the pseudo-randomness or entropy in how it calculates those prime gaps begins to shift and degrade.
so the system uses pure number theory as a heartbeat monitor.
Exactly.
If the prime calculations start stuttering, the firmware knows it's moving up the 0 to 12 stress taxonomy.
It is a brilliant utilization of fundamental mathematics to monitor hardware state.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The number theory doesn't stop at prime gap entropy. To secure the firmware, the Aegis project introduces OraSeal integration, which relies heavily on perfect numbers.
Numbers that are equal to the sum of their proper divisors.
Exactly. But how does an elementary concept from number theory translate into a cryptographic lock for the RAF architecture?
This is defined in the papers as the divisor echo hypothesis. The architecture uses the properties of perfect numbers to establish a perfect validation record for every single component within the system.
Okay.
For a component to be considered perfectly valid, there must be an exact mathematically perfect relationship between the component's cryptographic hash and the policy divisors assigned to it.
The source material specifies the use of greatest common divisors, or GCD, and least common multiples, or LCM. How are those applied as cryptographic proofs?
The GCD is used to mathematically prove that the active policy preserves the underlying identity of the component. Conversely, the LCM is used to prove that the component itself is preserved under the constraints of the policy.
It is a dual-layered proof.
It is. But the definitive lock is that the summation of all the policy divisors must perfectly equal the hash itself.
The divisors literally echo the hash. That creates a bidirectional trust mechanism. You aren't just checking a digital signature against a certificate authority. You are interlocking the mathematical integrity of the code with its cryptographic authenticity.
And that interlock is incredibly fragile to tampering, which is precisely the point.
Because if you change anything,
If a malicious actor alters a single bit of the component's code, the underlying hash changes.
wow,
The moment the hash changes, the summation of the policy divisors no longer equals the hash. The mathematical perfection shatters instantly, and the OraSeal validation fails, immediately throwing the system into a higher RAF stress zone.
that mathematical lock sounds virtually unbreakable under current computing paradigms. But that brings us to the ultimate threat model detailed in the papers. What happens when large-scale quantum computers come online?
The big question.
Machines capable of running Shor's algorithm to simply smash through traditional public key cryptography. Does the OraSeal system hold up against a quantum brute force attack?
Well, traditional cryptography heavily relies on the difficulty of factoring large numbers, a problem quantum computers are theoretically designed to solve with trivial ease. To counter this, the Aegis project integrates lattice-based cryptography.
For those trying to visualize this, standard encryption is like hiding a secret behind a massive multiplication problem. Lattice-based encryption hides it inside a multidimensional geometric grid, correct?
Yes. Imagine a grid spanning hundreds or even thousands of dimensions. Finding the shortest vector to a specific point in that immense geometric space is a problem that remains computationally hard even for quantum algorithms.
Even for quantum computers.
Exactly. However, the Aegis project doesn't just statically deploy a lattice, it actively deploys lattice-based space deformation.
Deforming the cryptographic space implies the grid itself is moving or warping while under attack.
Under a simulated quantum attack, the system applies a deformation function to slightly warp the geometry of the lattice. It forces the attacking quantum algorithm to constantly recalculate its vectors.
And it does this safely.
Crucially, yes. The system executes this warp within a strictly defined mathematical bound, represented by the variable epsilon.
The epsilon bound.
Right. By keeping the deformation confined within the epsilon bound, the firmware ensures that the underlying hardness of the security proof remains intact. The system actively absorbs the kinetic energy of the quantum attack by bending the cryptographic space, but it never breaks the core structure.
It acts as a multidimensional shock absorber.
That's a great way to put it.
We've explored algorithms that autonomously hunt for dimensional weaknesses, systems that measure their own stress using prime numbers, and dynamic quantum-resistant geometric grids. But the papers make it clear that all this autonomous, highly technical firmware is ultimately regulating systems meant to serve human stakeholders.
Which brings us to the governance layer of the architecture. Git-RAF policy integration. The authors explicitly acknowledge that raw mathematics cannot serve as the sole arbiter of operational policy.
Now, most developers know Git as a version control system for tracking changes in software code. But here, OpenX's computing is utilizing it as a version control system for human governance.
Exactly. Even if the dimensional game theory engine computes a mathematically flawless strategic response to a market shift, and even if the OR-Seal perfect number validation confirms the code is untampered, the system requires multi-stakeholder validation to execute.
The mathematical framework acts as the advisory engine.
But policy activation requires human consensus.
The human element retains the final authorization. The paper defines this consensus requirement using the threshold variable theta set at a strict 67%, or 0.67.
A supermajority of the distributed key holders must cryptographically sign off on the policy change. This proves that within this highly automated quantum-hardened architecture, distributed key management and human agreement are non-negotiable.
The math proposes the optimal path, but the 67% consensus executes it. So what does this all mean? Let's synthesize the architectural journey we've taken through these sources today. We started with dimensional game theory, learning how algorithms use PCA to isolate strategic imbalances and exploit them.
Right.
We looked at how dynamic real-world variables undergo scalar promotion and how the system rigorously caps that complexity using activation thresholds to avoid computational collapse.
The tau and theta thresholds.
Exactly. We explored the RAF firmware architecture, which monitors its own stress through the entropy of prime number calculations. We unpacked how system components are mathematically locked using the divisor-echo hypothesis and perfect numbers. And finally, we saw how the Aegis project absorbs quantum threats by dynamically deforming lattice spaces, all while tethering the final execution to a strict 67% human consensus via Git-RAF.
The synthesis of game theory, pure number theory, and cryptographic governance here is just remarkable. And the relevance to you, the listener, navigating an increasingly automated world is profound. As you interact with complex financial networks, autonomous logistics, and secure communications, you are engaging with systems that face intense dynamic pressure.
They really do.
The most robust systems being built today do not simply react to stress. They mathematically optimize their operational strategy to survive it. They rely on architectures that degrade gracefully through structured taxonomies, bending the cryptographic space to protect their core logic rather than failing catastrophically.
They are engineered for resilience at a fundamental mathematical level.
They are. But this raises an important question, though, a final provocative thought I want to leave you with, which naturally emerges from the implications of these papers.
I'd love to hear it.
If dimensional game theory allows an algorithm to autonomously detect and adapt to abstract strategic dimensions, what happens when an advanced AI system, operating within this quantum-resistant framework, discovers a highly effective, dominant strategic dimension that human stakeholders lack the capacity to even perceive.
An axis of behavior or strategy that is completely orthogonal to human logic.
Exactly. The internal mathematics of the RAF architecture might definitively prove that this imperceptible strategy is the perfect response to maintain system integrity. But how does a Git RAF consensus of human stakeholders vote on a policy that is mathematically flawless yet entirely incomprehensible to the human mind?
Wow.
When the algorithm drops that red map pin on a dimension we cannot understand, do we trust the perfection of the math? Or do we rely on the limitations of our 67% human threshold?
That is a haunting and brilliant architectural paradox to end on. A massive thank you to you for joining us on this custom deep dive today. Keep questioning the algorithms, keep looking for those hidden strategic dimensions, and always keep questioning the firmware of the world around you.